What's up guys, my name is Ace, and today we're going to be talking about weapon balancing patches in Call of Duty and whether or not it's a bad thing to be doing consistent weapon balancing patches throughout the life cycle of a game. Let's get into it. Alright guys, so every single time we get one of these weapon balancing patches like we got this past week where several different guns are changed, it's not just like a little tweak for one or two guns, it's several different guns that are being changed. Every time this happens, there is always something that pops up in the community with people that are complaining about the fact that we shouldn't be getting these weapon balancing changes throughout the game's life cycle. I think most people in the community can agree that weapon balancing is very important for the first month or two of a game's life cycle because they do kind of have to figure things out once they get the game in the hands of millions of people. But a lot of the complaints come from the people that feel that there shouldn't be weapon balancing patches later on in the game's life cycle, kind of where we are right now with Infinite Warfare. So the big question is this bad overall for the community and for the game to be doing these weapon balancing patches many months after launch? Well, looking from the perspective of the people that don't like these weapon balancing patches, one of the bigger arguments that they have is that they don't like that they have to constantly adapt to the new meta. So maybe they just got really good with a gun finally, and they finally figured out how to use it and everything, but then it gets nerfed and something else gets buffed, and now they feel like they have to go and try out that gun if they want to remain competitive in the game. Or maybe they just have that gun that they absolutely love and they just want to hang on to and they're really effective with it and they love it and they never want things to change because the game just works perfectly for them and their playstyle with that particular gun, and they don't like that suddenly they have to change things up because the weapon balancing changed. Another argument that I see against these weapon balancing changes throughout the life cycle is there's actually people out there that really truly believe that there should be overpowered guns and then just basically terrible guns in the game. This is what they find to be fun balancing within the game. I think the majority of players would disagree with this, but there definitely are those people out there, and I wanted to at least mention that side to it. And the final argument, at least out of the top 3 arguments that I see against these weapon balancing changes, is that it really screws people over when they're going for challenges. And this is one that I absolutely can stand behind and do agree with to an extent. If we look at all those camo grinders out there are people that grinded the howitzer camos and actually got dark matter back when the howitzer was bugged, like severely bugged, and it was extremely difficult to get the challenges done. If you think the challenges for the howitzer are difficult now, you should have seen it 3 or 4 months ago. It was absolute hell to try and get those challenges completed, but there are people out there that were dedicated, they put in the time and the effort, and they got those camos done. And it was really impressive to see someone with Black Sky back then because everybody knew just how difficult it was to get those challenges completed. Then they gave the howitzer a buff, they fixed those bugs and everything, and now that accomplishment suddenly doesn't mean nearly as much anymore because it's a lot easier to do it. And the same thing applies to other guns as well, not just the howitzer which was bugged, but if you look at some of the guns that were maybe just completely underpowered or outclassed way back in the day, people grinded through the camos, got those camos, and it was a real accomplishment. And then as soon as they buff that gun, it's no longer really that accomplishment, or at least nobody else really sees that accomplishment because anybody that completes the challenge now has the exact same camo that you had when you completed that challenge when the gun was terrible. So I can definitely understand the frustration there with the people that have worked through the hard times with a bad gun, only to have that gun buffed, and then suddenly it feels like they just wasted their time with it. Now, one mention I should also throw in here, I didn't want to include it as my top 3 because most of the time we're talking about public matches, but I can also really see the frustration on the competitive side of things when they make a serious weapon balancing change shortly before a large event. I believe it was CWL Dallas. Just before CWL Dallas, I think about a week before, the Type 2 got a massive buff and it suddenly fit into the competitive meta, and some would argue that it actually became more powerful than the guns that were being used at the time in the meta, which was the NV4 and the K-Bar. Just imagine being a pro player in any sport. You're practicing like crazy, you got this big event coming up, you and your team are just practicing, and then suddenly they completely change the rules of the game a week before the event. That's really unfair to me, especially when a lot of people are doing this for a living, there is a lot of money on the line, and it is a huge deal to be doing that. So I definitely wanted to throw that into this video here, I felt like it needed to be said, but overall we're focusing on public matches for the rest of this video. So now that we've had a look at the reasons that people tend to bring up for why they don't like weapon balancing patches later in a game's life cycle, I want to share my opinion, and I am somebody that strongly agrees with weapon balancing patches as long as they're done right and as long as they're spaced out properly. Weapon balancing patches throughout a game's life cycle they will evolve the meta. And like I was saying, a lot of people don't like to relearn that, but for me, I feel like it brings life into the game. The game evolves, and that allows you to evolve as a player. Things don't get stale as easy because the overall meta is changing, and you're constantly being encouraged to try out the new guns that are getting buffed, and drop the old guns that used to be the top tier ones, drop those ones a little bit, and move on to learning something different, playing with a new gun, figuring out how that gun works, and how to make it work for your playstyle, so that you can succeed with it. Without these weapon balancing changes, if they would have just left it the way it was before, you would barely see any SMGs used because the aim assist ranges would have been terrible, and the sprint out time would have been the same with the assault rifles and LMGs anyways, so there's really no reason to use SMGs. And if we look way back to like the original meta of the game, you'd be seeing NV4s, K-bars, and the raw LMG. Those would be the guns that everybody just falls back to, falls into, and they're the ones that get used all the time. Without these weapon balancing patches, there's no variety in the game, and things would get stale really quickly. If you guys remember back to the big SMG buff where they buffed the target assist range, and they changed the sprint out times up so that the LMGs had a different sprint out time to the SMGs, it changed the overall meta of the game, and it changed the overall pace of the game. It's like you're playing a new and improved version of the game that you were playing before. So things were starting to get stale, you didn't really want to go to an SMG unless you kind of wanted to challenge yourself, or if you were on a select few maps in the game. And that gets boring over time. So this is the main reason that I love those weapon balancing changes. The game evolves and you evolve with it. You're not playing the same game 6 months down the road as you were playing when the game first launched. You've evolved, you've adapted, you've played with different iterations of the game, and hopefully that's made you a more well-rounded player as time goes on as well. Also, when you work to balance guns and really just perfect that overall weapon balance where every gun is a viable choice depending on your playstyle and how you handle the gun, I think that's what we should be aiming for. That way, if somebody's using what's considered to be one of the best guns in the game, there's some counterplay. You can use any one of the other guns, and as long as you play the situations right, you have the ability to counter that player without just caving and using what he's using in order to compete. So in my opinion, having these weapon balancing changes throughout the game's life cycle and constantly working to perfect that weapon balance while still giving each weapon its own unique characteristics and feel, I think that's the best way to approach it. And I really like that that's what they tend to do with this. Now I will say this can still go wrong if they do it improperly. So first off, if the balancing change is too far in one direction, then that could really screw with things, and that's definitely a bad thing for the game overall. I'm looking at you, VPR buff. I still don't know whose idea it was to buff the VPR quite like they initially did, but in my mind that completely ruined any sort of weapon balance in the game when they first buffed the VPR. I did feel back then it needed a little bit of a buff, but that was way too far, and that's a perfect example of a bad weapon balancing change. So when they are balancing weapons, I definitely prefer it when they make small incremental changes. So they buff something just a little bit or dial something back just a little bit, and then if it needs a little bit more in the future, then they can do that. I think that's the right way to go with it, instead of just completely changing things. And also, I will say timing is important with these weapon balancing changes. I feel like if they do them too frequently, or at least like the big weapon balancing changes, if they do them too frequently, then it gets really annoying because nobody really has time to get used to the new meta, and I can definitely understand the frustrations if they do that. But generally, I feel like they've been pretty good. They make bigger weapon balancing changes like this past week where they're changing like 4 or 5 or 6 different guns. They do that, I think, once every like month and a half or so. And then maybe there's a few little changes made here and there within it, and I think those little changes are fine as well. But as far as big changes go, I think they should be spacing them out like they are, and overall, I feel like Infinity Ward has been doing quite a good job with this throughout the year, with the exception of that VPR buff. So the answer to the question, are weapon balancing patches throughout the game's lifecycle a bad thing? In my opinion, absolutely not. They are a very good thing when they're done right, when they're spaced out properly. I think it's the proper way to handle things because the game evolves and improves over time when you do this. And with that, I'd like to know in the comment section below, what's your opinion on this? Do you think weapon balancing patches, when they're done right, are a good thing or a bad thing overall for a game throughout its entire life cycle? Also, just speaking of Infinite Warfare specifically, are there any other weapon balancing changes that you'd like to see made? Is there any gun that you still feel is overpowered or underpowered, maybe needs a little bit of a nerf or a little bit of a buff? Please let me know down below. If you enjoyed the video, a like rating is always appreciated, and don't forget to subscribe for more if you haven't already. I'll talk to you guys next time.